9 days. Marriage day now. Of course, obvious baya nga si Darnay yun, but you know. The marriage day was shining brightly, and they were ready outside the closed door of the doctor's room, where he was speaking to Charles Darnay. They were ready to go to church. The beautiful bride, Mr. Lorry, and Miss Pross, to whom the event, through a gradual process of reconcilement to the inevitable, would have been one of absolute bliss, but for the yet lingering consideration that her brother Solomon should have been the bridegroom. So Miss Pross was really like hoping that um, Lady Bird would marry her brother Solomon. And so, said Mr. Lorry, who could not sufficiently admire the bride, and who had been moving round her to take in every point of her quiet, pretty dress, and so it was for this, my sweet Lucy, that I brought you across the channel. Oh, I love Mr. Lorry. Such a baby. Lord bless me, how little I thought what I was doing. How lightly I valued the obligation I was conferring on my friend, Mr. Charles. You didn't mean it, remarked the matter-of-fact Miss Pross, and therefore how could you know it? Nonsense. Really? Well, but don't cry, said the gentle Mr. Lorry. I am not crying, said Miss Pross. You are. Chemistry. I, my Pross? Oh, my Pross. By this time, Mr. Lorry dared to be pleasant with her on occasion. You were just now. I saw you do it, and I don't wonder at it. Such a present of plate as you have made him is enough to bring tears to anybody's eyes. There's not a fork or a spoon in the collection, said Miss Pross, that I didn't cry over last night after the box came, till I couldn't see it. I am highly gratified, said Mr. Lorry, though upon my honor I had no intention of rendering those trifling articles of remembrance invisible to anyone. Dear me, this is an occasion that makes a man speculate on all he has lost. Dear, dear, dear. To think that there might have been a Mrs. Lorry any time these 50 years almost. Naapaman chance, Miss Prosday. Not at all, from Miss Pross. You think there never might have been a Mr. Lorry? Asked a gentleman of that name. A Mrs. Lorry? Asked the gentleman of that name. Pooh, rejoined Miss Pross. You are a bachelor in your cradle. Well, observed Mr. I keep mixing their names, Mr. Lorry, beamingly adjusting his little wig. That seems probable too. And you were cut out for a bachelor, pursued Miss Pross, before you were put in your cradle. Then I think, said Mr. Lorry, that I was unhandsomely dealt with, and that I ought to have had a voice in the selection of my pattern. Enough. Now, my dear Lucy, drawing his arms soothingly around her waist, I hear them moving in the next room, and Miss Pross and I, as two formal folks of business, are anxious not to lose the final opportunity of saying something to you that you wish to hear. You leave your good father, my dear, in hands as earnest and as loving as your own. He shall be taken every conceivable care of during the next fortnight when you are in Warwickshire and thereabouts. Even Tellson shall go to the wall, comparatively speaking, before him. And when, at the fortnight's end, he comes to join you and your beloved husband, and on your other fortnight's trip in Wales, you shall say that we have sent him to you in the best health and in the happiest frame. Now I hear. Now I hear somebody step coming to the door. Let me kiss my dear girl with an old-fashioned bachelor blessing before somebody comes to claim his own. So, Mr. Larry was just say, don't worry. In the 2 weeks that you will be honeymooning, we will take care of your dad. And then moapas man si daddy after 2 weeks, and then you, the four of you, or the three of you will go on vacation. We will send him to you happy and healthy. For a moment he held the fair face from him to look at the well-remembered expression on the forehead, and then laid the bright golden hair against his little brown wig, with a genuine tenderness and delicacy which, if such things be old-fashioned, were as old as Adam. The door of the doctor's room opened, and he came out with Charles Darnay. He was so deadly pale, which had not been the case when they went in together. Remember the promise? He said, you tell me who you really are on the morning of your wedding day. So obviously, we are at a situation where Charles Darnay just told the doctor who he really is. And we all know who he really is. And the doctor was now all pale and stuff. My gosh. He was so deadly pale, which had not been the case when they went in together. that no vestige of color was to be seen in his face. But in the composure of his manner he was unaltered, except that to the shrewd glance of Mr. Lorry it disclosed some shadowy indication that the old air of avoidance and dread had lately passed over him like a cold wind. He gave his arm to his daughter and took her downstairs to the chariot which Mr. Lorry had hired in honor of the day. The rest followed in another carriage, and soon in the neighboring church, where no strange eyes looked on, Charles Darnay and Lucy Manette were happily married. So it was such a simple, intimate wedding. What a nice wedding, said no? Beside the glancing tears that shone among the smiles of the little group when it was done, some diamonds, very bright and sparkling, glanced on the bride's hand, which were newly released from the dark obscurity of one of Mr. Lorry's pockets. They returned home to breakfast, and all went well, and in due course the golden hair that had mingled with the poor shoemaker's white locks in the Paris garret were mingled with them again in the morning sunlight on the threshold of the door at parting. It was a hard parting, though it was not for long, but her father cheered, and said at last, gently disengaging himself from her enfolding arms, "Take her, Charles, she is yours." And her agitated hand waved to them from a chaise window, and she was gone. The corner being out of the way of the idle curious, and the preparations having been very simple and few, the doctor, Mr. Lorry, and Miss Pross were left quite alone. It was when they turned into the welcome shade of the cool old hall that Mr. Lorry observed a great change to have come over the doctor, as if the golden arm uplifted there and struck him a poisonous blow. He, he had naturally repressed much, and some revulsion might have been expected in him when the occasion for repression was gone. But it was the old sacred lost look that troubled Mr. Lorry, and though his absent manner of clasping his head and drearily wandering away into his own room when they got upstairs, Mr. Lorry was reminded of Deforge, the wine shop keeper, and the starlight ride. So um, when they left, the moment they left, the doctor's expression changed quite significantly. And Mr. Lorry was very, very worried. Oh my gosh, this really looks bad. This is really, really bad. "I think," he whispered to Miss Pross after anxious consideration, "I think we had best not speak to him just now or at all disturb him. I must look in at Elson's, so I will go there at once and come back presently. Then we will take him a ride into the country and dine there, and all will be well." Okay, so it was easier for Mr. Lorry to look in at Tellson's than to look out of Tellson's. He was detained 2 hours. When he came back, he ascended the old staircase alone, having asked no question of the servant, going thus into the doctor's room, and was stopped by the low sound of knocking. He said with a start, "What is that?" Miss Pross, with a terrified face, was at his ear. Oh me, all is lost!" she cried, wringing her hands. "What is to be told to Ladybird? He doesn't know me, and is making shoes, so he cannot recognize Miss Pross any more." Mr. Lorry said what he could to calm her, and went himself into the doctor's room. The bench was turned towards the light, as it had been when he had seen the shoemaker at his work before, and his head was bent down, and he was very busy. "Dr. Manette, my dear friend, Dr. Manette." The doctor looked at him for a moment, half inquiringly, half as if he were angry at being spoken to, and bent over his work again. He had laid aside his coat and waistcoat, his shirt was open at the throat, as it used to be when he did that work, and even the old haggard, faded surface of face had come back to him. He worked hard, impatiently, as if in some sense of having been interrupted. Mr. Lorry glanced at the work in his hands, and observed that it was a shoe of the old size and shape. He took up another that was lying by him, and asked what it was. "A young lady's walking shoe," he muttered, without looking up. "It ought to have been finished long ago. Let it be. But, Dr. Manette, look at me." He obeyed, in the old mechanically submissive manner, without pausing in his work. "You know me, my dear friend. Think again. This is not your proper occupation. Think, dear friend." Okay, you read all the way to until the word that says Dr. Manette took what was given to him to eat. Okay, so pause. Dr. Manette took what was given him to eat and drink, and worked on the first day until it was too dark to see. worked on half an hour after Mr. Lorry could not have seen for his life to read or write. When he put his tools aside as useless until morning, Mr. Lorry rose and said to him, "Will you go out?" He looked down at the floor on either side of him in the old manner, looked up in the old manner, and repeated in a low voice, "Out?" Kaya he thought na yun he was back in the Bastille. "Yes, for a walk with me. Why not?" He made no effort to say why not. Okay, read until when it fell dark again. Okay, pause. When it fell dark again, Mr. Lorry asked him as before, "Dear doctor, will you go out?" As before, he repeated, "Out?" "Yes, for a walk with me. Why not?" This time Mr. Lorry feigned to go out when he could extract no answer from him, and after remaining absent for an hour, returned. In the meanwhile the doctor had removed to the seat in the window, and had sat there looking down at the plane tree, but on Mr. Lorry's return he slipped away to his bench. The time went very slowly on, and Mr. Lorry's hope darkened. His heart grew heavier again, and grew yet heavier and heavier every day. The third day came and went, the fourth, the fifth, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, 8 days, 9 days. With the hope ever darkening, and with a heart always growing heavier and heavier, Mr. Lorry passed through this anxious time. The secret was well kept, and Lucy was unconscious and happy. Meaning she did not know, not nga she was unconscious, like she fainted somewhere. He could not fail to observe that the shoemaker, whose hand had been a little out at first, was growing dreadfully skillful. So Dr. Manette was even getting better, and that he had never been so intent on his work, that his hands had never been so nimble and expert as in the dusk of the 9th evening. Trouble.